The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago.
Is there light at the end of the deep tunnel? The biggest flood control reservoir in the world is about to go online, but will it prevent the pollution of Lake Michigan?
Plus, 5 million Americans are now living with Alzheimer's disease. That number expected to skyrocket as the baby boomers age. Could simple lifestyle changes tip the odds in our favor? Chicago's top medical experts are at the forefront of some leading research.
Illinois Governor Rauner makes an end around the budget stalemate to cut spending on popular programs. Democrats are crying foul. Tonight, these stories and more on In the Loop. Good evening. I'm Chris Bury.
And I'm Robin Robinson. Tonight on In the Loop, the $3 billion deep tunnel project marks a major milestone this month.
That's when a giant wastewater reservoir begins operation just south of Chicago. The massive engineering endeavor is supposed to help ease the flooding that occurs whenever a major storm hits the Chicago area.
But 40 years after this project started, basements are still filling up with water, causing millions of dollars in damage and untold heartache during heavy storms.
So are there better, more cost-effective ways to help end that persistent flooding and prevent pollution at the same time?
It's about 1,400 feet long and it's about 30 feet diameter.
Just entering the massive deep tunnel system conveys a sense of what an engineering marvel it is. A 109-mile network of tunnels drilled through bedrock 300 feet below the streets of Chicago and its suburbs. Back in the 1960s, engineers conceived the ambitious project as a solution to the area's perennial flooding. Mariana Spiropoulos is the president of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, the agency in charge of the deep tunnel system, also known as the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, or TARP.
When we're having these really intense rainstorms, it's sort of stressing the system. So the deep tunnel system, the tunnel and the reservoirs, is created to alleviate that flooding.
Just to give you an idea of the scope of this project, this is one of 3 giant reservoirs that will hold storm and sewage water. It's called the Thornton Reservoir, an old limestone pit south of Chicago. You could fit 12 Soldier Fields in here, 8 billion gallons of water. And when this is completed, it will be the largest reservoir of its kind in the world. During a major storm, a surge of raw sewage and stormwater would come barreling through this connector tunnel and fill the reservoir as much as 300 feet deep. That's an 8 billion gallon open sewer of murky water. To minimize the odor, floating aerators powered by solar panels will churn the cesspool, adding oxygen to the mix. Then, during dry weather, the water will be piped to a wastewater treatment plant to be cleaned and then released. But the entire project won't be complete until 2029, not soon enough for flood-weary Chicagoans. From 2007 to 2011, the federal government and private insurers paid at least $660 million for residential flooding claims in the Chicago area. That works out to 1 out of 6 properties suffering water damage. To help explain why the Chicago area is so vulnerable to flooding, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District put together an animated video. Most area homes and businesses are hooked up to a local sewer system, which combines raw sewage and rainwater that flows into a larger intercepting sewer. During a heavy rain, sewers fill to capacity and the overflow pours into area rivers and Lake Michigan. TARP, or the Deep Tunnel System, is supposed to solve that. But even those massive 30-foot tunnels aren't enough sometimes, and raw sewage still ends up in area waterways. When the local sewer system gets overwhelmed, that's when those basement backups occur. To solve that problem, massive reservoirs have been built to take that excess water and hold it until the storms pass, allowing time for the water to be treated and then released. Meanwhile, some Chicago area residents fed up with flooded basements have spent thousands of dollars on flood control systems. Patrick Martin is the president of Expert Flood Control, one of several such companies doing this type of work in Chicago.
When we get anything over an inch to 2 inches that fall within an hour, we get a numerous amount of calls for basement flooding issues.
Martin's company charges nearly $8,000 for a typical flood control system, similar to this one being installed at a home in West suburban River Forest. He says business is booming. Martin recommends that homeowners disconnect their downspouts from the sewer system and reroute that water into their front or backyards.
On an average 1,000 square foot roof, 1 inch of rain produces 1,000 gallons of water.
Margaret Frisbee, executive director of Friends of the Chicago River, says while the deep tunnel has improved water quality, urban development has paved over the region's natural ability to absorb rainwater, leaving it with nowhere to go but into the sewer system.
So we've effectively put a plastic cover over the whole county, the whole region, and so we drive stormwater into the sewer system, and so it's clean rainwater that's now turned into garbage.
And climatologists say changing weather patterns, including more frequent storms and heavier rains, could make the deep tunnel obsolete. When the system is finished over the next 14 years, it will have a combined capacity of more than 20 billion gallons. But that's still not enough.
What happens when you get 6 inches of rainfall, such as happened in summer of 2013, is that something like 65 billion gallons of water fall on Cook County in a very short period of time, and it has nowhere to go.
Scott Bernstein, president of the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, says his group is pushing green infrastructure as the solution to ongoing flooding. For instance, green alleys that allow rainwater to soak into the ground, and rain gardens like this one installed at the home of Lori Burns in the Chatham neighborhood, which soaks up all the rain pouring off her roof.
That entire basin is full, and the plants that live there really enjoy wet soil, and they have really deep roots, and the water just slowly infiltrates and goes where it's supposed to go instead of in my basement.
Burns says her basement used to flood every time it rained hard, but since the rain garden was installed, she says her basement has remained dry.
The added benefit is it's a pollinator's garden, so you can see like butterflies and bees. They really love to come, eat, hang out. It's something that is a full circle benefit to both nature and to us as a family.
When it's all completed in 2029, the projected final cost of TARP, or Deep Tunnel, is expected to be nearly $4 billion. Now, Robin and this week's panel tackle the trending topics, including that budget deadlock in Springfield.
Thank you so much, Chris. Tonight, joining us on our panel, Ron Sandak, State Representative for the 81st District, Amisha Patel, Executive Director for Grassroots Collaborative, and Natalie Moore, reporter for WBEZ Radio, Southside Bureau. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Representative Sandak, we are coming up on this is our 3-month anniversary of being a state without a budget. And you are the head of what turns out to be an important committee down in Springfield, the Appropriations and Administrative Rules Committee. You're the co-chair. And there was accusation that through that committee, the governor's made an in-run around his inability to actually cut the budget, and that it's impacting people in social services, people who need services.
I think it's an unfair accusation, though I certainly understand the emotion with these types of services and where we are as a state financially and without a budget. The fact of the matter is we are on autopilot. Our state is about spending, depending on who you ask, upwards of 85, maybe as high as 93, 94% of our appropriations without a budget. And pursuant to the Constitution, that's actually in violation of the bedrock foundations of having the appropriation authority. So this governor is trying to contain, control, and manage the little that he actually has the control over.
And that turns out, though, in most people's opinion, to be balancing it or doing things that only require sacrifice of the neediest.
And believe me, no one likes that. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, Robin, we have continuing appropriations which are embedded in statutes from governors and legislatures before. We have court orders and we have consent decrees. And those court orders and consent decrees and continuing appropriations have this legislature on the sideline doing really nothing while the governor tries to manage what's left.
Amisha, do you feel like the part that the governor can impact is not equal to shared sacrifice?
Well, I think this question of sacrifice and sharing sacrifice is important because I think what always ends up happening is those who are asked to do that sharing of sacrifice are the elderly, are people who are dependent on childcare, who are, who have disabilities. I think the real question is is everyone really sharing in sacrifice? Are the folks who are the wealthiest in the state, corporations, big banks actually being asked to do any sacrificing in this moment? And they're not, right? The sacrifice is all going to those who have the least to give.
But even those who aren't in that situation they care for those who are being impacted by this. So are you seeing pressure building as we see more effect on the neediest population?
I think some. I think what's scary is that people are pretty numb. People have gone numb to this crisis. And so we've got a new norm of dysfunctionality that's sort of set across the state. I think the challenge is actually bringing to life those stories of people who are being directly impacted, because a lot of folks are acting like nothing is really happening when the opposite is actually true.
And Natalie, there's a PR war going on as to who should be blamed for this standoff. Who's winning?
I don't think there are any winners
here. Who are people blaming?
I think they're blaming politicians as one big entity. And to Amisha's point about, do we see who these people are at WBEZ? I haven't been a part of it, but we've been doing a series of narrative first-person stories about folks who are impacted by some of these cuts. Even before, today's announcement of cuts in social services, just to put a face to some of these things, because you might hear 10,000 people are going to experience this law, 12,000 people here. You just hear round numbers, right? And you don't hear what does that impact mean for people who are some of the most vulnerable in the state.
Representative Standek, are those personal stories of people who are suffering? Does that seem to be a fair way to cover this story?
Certainly. Look, you can look at this issue from a myriad of angles, and certainly the personal experience of someone who typically got services, who may be on the verge of losing some or all of those services, is absolutely fair game for discussion, and it's part of the process. However, I think, to be fair, we can't do this in a vacuum. We need to be looking at the entirety of Illinois' financial condition. I agree that everyone and everything should be fair game to legitimate discussion and debate. We haven't gotten there, Robin, and that's part of my problem. We haven't had those meaningful discussions.
Speaking of legitimate discussion, is the governor having any kind of contact with Speaker Madigan?
I don't know. My gut would tell me no, but I can't say that either way. I'm certainly not at that level. I do know, because I've talked to the governor and I've talked to the governor's staff. They are ready, willing, and able to talk to anyone and everyone at any time. And I know I heard from Senator Cullerton talking about he's ready, willing, and able, and that's great. But without Speaker Madigan, no discussion really is complete, because, for all intents and purposes, he controls the legislature.
What could happen in your mind, Amisha, that would force these parties together?
I think it's a question of continuing to figure out how do we apply pressure. The fact is that as long as people think there's not really a crisis, there's not a lot of expectation or pressure to be able to put on legislators. I'm hearing that they're talking about maybe January or later in 2016 when we're going to actually have a budget. Nobody knows what's happening in this moment, and I think the real problem here is that there are people's lives who are being directly affected every single day.
And not just that personal story, but there is perhaps something to appeal to the business community, Natalie. I've been seeing stories about the higher cost in the end of what we're doing right now.
I think it's going to take a broad coalition of different types of Illinoisans to rise up and demand something, because I think people see that this is a lot of political play that is taking place. I get press releases several times a week from different groups who are protesting down in Springfield, or who are doing a protest at the State of Illinois building in downtown Chicago, trying to drum up support about what these cuts mean, and not just the personal face to it.
But the dollar figure that this could end up costing us more in the long run. All right, let's change gears and talk about a different kind of a cost, a human cost. Chicago once again making national news for the violence after a particularly bloody weekend, and people have been tallying up, the year-long total, 2,300 people shot, not killed, fortunately, so far this year. The police superintendent said today that we need gun control and we need sentencing reform. Does that seem to you, Natalie, to be the same old story, or is it really part of the answer?
It's part of the same old story, and I don't think that it is fully the answer. When people feel that their safety is under attack, I think it's easier for politicians and people like the police chief to say, oh, we need mandatory minimums, when there's a lot of research out there that says that that is not going to be effective in getting guns off the street. We don't talk about we talk about violence very isolated, and it's a symptom of larger problems that are happening in under-resourced communities. And until there's a holistic conversation about, violence is happening in contained places. If you look at the unemployment, the poverty, higher rates of preventable diseases, there are all these ills that are happening.
All together.
Right. And we only choose to talk about violence, and I get it that can have the most impact for people. And, the media has made decisions to cover that, and that is, how we choose to look at these communities.
Representative Sandak, is there some deeper answer, and is there something that state lawmakers can do besides gun control and sentencing reform?
I sure hope so. I mean, I couldn't agree more that this is kind of the same old story. I don't want to criticize the superintendent or the mayor, but if we had kind of moved those press conferences around, maybe even a year ago, they would sound exactly the same as they did. And it's frustrating for me. I agree, mandatory minimums actually prove there's no end game there. We have too many people in prisons right now. I think we are really good at putting people in prison. We have lots of people in prison for petty, minor drug offenses. Certainly differentiating violent acts from some of the petty crimes we're talking about is important, but we've got lots of laws. And we've done this, we got to get guns off the streets. I wish we would turn our attention to illegal guns like we did the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s. It seems to me that is one of the most difficult, daunting, unanswerable problems we've had.
Well, they said we haven't won the war on drugs, but the mayor does continue to talk about gun control as well as values. Here's what he said, and it does sound a little familiar.
I'm going to try to control my anger. We have way too many guns on the streets of the city of Chicago with too little values and the penalties that don't match the values of the city of Chicago.
Amisha, too little values. Some would argue that these are in communities that haven't been shown any value by the powers that be for generations.
Absolutely. If we're going to talk about values, let's talk about the value of investing in low-income communities and communities of color. We talk about, like Natalie said, these cluster effects. So people talk about food deserts when people don't live near, have access to grocery stores. We talk about wage deserts. So those are the same communities that don't have access to good jobs. You layer in all these effects, and that's where community violence is happening. How are we investing back in our neighborhoods, making sure we've got quality jobs for Black and Latino workers? How are we making sure that we've got programs like that the state should be funding and instead is slashing, like ceasefire, after-school violence prevention programs? When we're cutting the safety net on top of not creating jobs in communities, it creates a very clear effect, and that is violence. And if the city cares about being a global city, we've got to talk about taking care of our neighborhoods. Chicago isn't a global city unless we can take care of our neighborhoods.
Very difficult problem, and maybe time for some new approaches. Let's get to some good news, especially if you're a Cubs fan. Only the Cubs could celebrate after a loss because somebody else lost, and therefore they clinched a wild card spot in the playoffs. We've already polled the panel. You are the lone Cubs fan, so Natalie, what does this mean for the city?
Well, yeah, and to clarify, I am more of a White Sox fan than a Cubs fan, but I
are so biased here today.
I root for both unless the Cubs are playing the White Sox.
So for the city.
Chicago is a sports city, and I think most of us want to see our teams win. There are some diehards on the south side or north side who may not feel that way, but it's good.
Okay. And it appears that they're successful not just on the field but off the field. The revenues are way up. They just got their lawsuit by the rooftop owners dismissed. Amisha, does this look like a nice concentration of sports power and revenue?
It does look like the Ricketts family is doing all right with their purchase of the Cubs. And I would say, you know, as they do better and better, let's tax them as we should and make sure that we've got money back into our state to pay for our community services.
Representative Sandak, are they sharing in any sacrifice around here?
Well, they paid a lot of money for the Chicago Cubs. As many people remember, they were criticized perhaps for overpaying. I'm glad there's a dividend. I suspect the Ricketts and all their financial endeavors pay a lot in taxes. Whether they should pay more or not, obviously for another show. I'm glad the Cubs are winning. I'm a White Sox fan too. I prefer the South Side team, but I remember 10 years ago telling my Cub friends, hey, enjoy as a city and as a state. I think my friends on the South Side, my White Sox colleagues ought to do the same and relish the Cubs moment right now.
All right, we're working on that home field advantage for that October 7th wild card game. Thank you so much, Representative Ron Sandak, Amisha Patel, Natalie Moore, sharing some time and expertise with us today. Alzheimer's disease affects millions of Americans, but there is welcome news for many who are living with that disease. Here now is Lauren Cohn.
Alzheimer's disease is now the 6th leading cause of death in the U.S., according to the National Institute for Aging. The progressive, irreversible brain disorder slowly destroys memory and thinking skills. But now there is mounting new evidence right here in Chicago that making simple lifestyle changes can ward off the disease. 5 million Americans are now living with Alzheimer's disease, but that is just the tip of the iceberg. As the baby boomers age, that number is expected to reach 28 million by the year 2050. And that iceberg, Tom Ostreicher has his own analogy.
Now, with a person with Alzheimer's, you're a glacier. Now, when you see little things fall off the glacier, and that's how it starts out. You know, you lose those little things. You might lose immediate memory, short-term memory, and then all of a sudden it gets bigger and bigger. And as you progress, with the disease, bigger chunks fall off that glacier until there's no glacier left.
The 67-year-old retired history professor and American Civil War expert lives with his wife Marilyn in Sycamore, Illinois.
I noticed when I was lecturing in classes, that stuff I've talked about for 30, 40 years, I was missing things. And I don't, you know, whether students realized it or not, but I realized it. I said, wow, why did I say that? How did I miss that?
Tom was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's a little less than 2 years ago.
When I had the brain scan, they noticed that the hippocampus in the back of the brain was shrinking at a much larger rate than it would be for somebody my age.
At first, when it first happened, he would come home from school every day, though, and just sit for a long time. And I said, okay, you're just going into this huge depression, which isn't going to help you or anyone else.
So the Ostreichers started walking more and planning trips, and Tom speaks as often as he can to groups of Alzheimer's patients, hoping to inspire them to do the same.
Be open about it. Be accepting of the fact, and not to hide, keep it hidden, and go about your daily life. I mean, don't just give up.
There is no cure for Alzheimer's. Tom is taking medication, but there is no sure sign for how slow or fast it will progress.
As a society, we've had such a defeatist attitude about Alzheimer's disease. We just kind of hurry up and wait, and we wait and wait and wait for someone to develop symptoms, and then we say, oh, Alzheimer's, too late, can't do anything. And I think that's exactly the wrong approach.
Dr. Demetrius Maraganori is the chairman of the Department of Neurology and medical director of the North Shore Neurological Institute. He runs the Center for Brain Health.
We're certainly the only program in the Chicagoland and in the Midwest that's taking a focus on primarily preventing Alzheimer's disease.
The program begins with a 20-question brain health quiz to help identify risk factors. Patients then become part of a comprehensive electronic record system where they're tracked and monitored. The center offers advanced testing from brain scans.
And the newest technologies we have are technologies that actually can detect abnormal deposits of a protein called amyloid, which we know is one of the telltale signs that your brain is aging and developing Alzheimer's changes.
To examining DNA, because one of the greatest risk factors for Alzheimer's is family history.
Someone who carries 1 or 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene or allele, those people have as high as a 70% likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease. And in women carrying that genetic type, as early as in their 20s, we can see changes in the brain scan.
In fact, it's estimated 1 in 5 women will get Alzheimer's disease in their lifetime. For men, it's 1 in 10.
Estrogen earlier in life plays a protective role in women, but it may be that the sudden loss of estrogen later in life has a rebound effect that contributes.
Dr. Mariganori says physical activity outdoors and exposure to vitamin D reduces risk.
A study showed a year or two ago that even if you take 70-year-olds and if you get them to aerobically exercise for 30 minutes 4 times a week, their hippocampi, the memory area of their brain, will literally grow. You can measure the memory area of your brain grow simply by doing the exercise. And then if you test their performance on memory tests, it exponentially improves according to how aerobic their exercise is.
And Dr. Mariganori pushes the Mediterranean diet, which is comprised of mostly fruits, vegetables, fish, healthy fats, and whole grains.
By intervening in at-risk people, we can reduce their risk profoundly. The other point is that we can delay the onset.
And there is more new evidence. What you eat may play a significant role in warding off Alzheimer's disease. Rush University Medical Center's nutritional epidemiologist Martha Claire Morris found following the MIND diet, a low-salt version of the Mediterranean diet, significantly lowers risk. The study tracked more than 1,000 adults for an average of 4.5 years.
They had a 53% reduction in the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. People who even had just moderate adherence to the diet had a 35% reduction in the risk.
The star of the MIND diet, berries, the only fruit specifically included because of their high levels of antioxidants and nutrients. This new information is news to Cindy and Kim Cerveni of Warrenville, Illinois, but it could prove to be very beneficial because Cindy was recently diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. She's 54.
Was having a problem getting all the pieces together to do my job, and it kept getting worse and worse. I would be leaving the house and coming back in 4 or 5 times because I forgot something. And
Cindy has since left her job and restructured her life.
now it's me to take this over and do my best for myself to keep my brain healthy and keep my body healthy and everything else. So that's my new job.
Cindy walks 5 miles every other day. She's changing her diet. She keeps her mind active by doing crossword puzzles and word searches. Her wife, Kim, is always by her side.
Anything I can do to stand by Cindy and encourage a healthy mind for her and for myself, because if I'm not healthy, I'm not a help to her either.
Know that just because you have Alzheimer's doesn't mean you can't do things. You can always try it, so always try. It will keep going and going and going until I can't go anymore.
To learn more about the Brain Health Center and other prevention programs in the Chicagoland area, including those offered by the Alzheimer's Association Illinois chapter, just go to our website at wycc.org.
And that wraps up this week's show. You are now in the loop.
Join us next week when I sit down with Archbishop Blaise Cupich as he reflects on his first year as head of the Archdiocese of Chicago. Until next time, I'm Chris Pure.
And I'm Robin Robinson. Good night.
Good night.